Why does something as simple as the color of your skin contain the entire history of human survival? Look at your hand right now. Whatever shade it happens to be. Whether you're pale enough to be mistaken for a sheet of paper or dark enough to absorb sunlight like a solar panel, that color didn't come from nowhere. It emerged from one of the longest, strangest, most dramatic transformations in the entire history of life on this planet. And the most extraordinary part? It wasn't random. It wasn't accidental. It wasn't some cosmic roll of the dice. What unfolded was a survival story. A slow-motion biological negotiation between your ancestors and the sun. And for the record, the sun was absolutely not playing fair. But what actually happened? Because the answer involves vitamin D, cancer, folate, Africa, ice ages, ancient farmers who accidentally rewired their own evolution, and a surprisingly indifferent star sitting 93 million miles away that set all of this in motion and has absolutely no regrets. Trace the human family tree all the way back, and here's what you find. Every single one of your ancestors, regardless of where you come from today, had dark skin. Every single one. Not most of them. Not the vast majority. All of them. Around 300,000 years ago, when Homo sapiens first emerged in Africa, the entire species was dark-skinned. No pale populations existed anywhere on Earth. Light skin as a concept simply hadn't appeared yet. Just sit with that for a second. Every person depicted in a history book, every ancient civilization, every mythology, every cave painting. All of it traces back to a single founding population that looked nothing like a substantial portion of modern humanity. Which means at some point, something happened. Something changed. And that change was so powerful, so deeply embedded into our DNA, that it reshaped the physical appearance of entire populations across multiple continents over tens of thousands of years. So what was it? Before getting there, and this matters more than you might think, it's worth understanding something fundamental about skin itself. Because most people genuinely have no idea what skin is actually doing for them right now. Skin tends to get treated like packaging, like the bag your body came in, the wrapping that holds your organs together while you go about your day. But skin is an organ. Your largest organ, actually, and it performs roughly 47 different functions simultaneously, most of which you never think about and certainly never thank it for. Among those functions, one of the most critical is protection from UV radiation. UV radiation is the invisible energy the sun fires at Earth constantly and without pause. And it is not your friend. UV light breaks chemical bonds. It damages DNA. It triggers mutations in your cells. And when those mutations accumulate in the wrong places over enough time, they develop into cancer. Specifically, melanoma, one of the most aggressive forms of skin cancer known to medicine. This is where skin color becomes directly relevant. The pigment responsible for skin color is called melanin. And in the most literal biological sense, melanin functions as a sunscreen, a natural, built-in, always active UV filter. The higher the melanin concentration in your skin, the darker it appears, and the more effectively it prevents UV radiation from reaching the deeper tissue layers where your DNA lives. Dark skin isn't just an aesthetic quality. It's a shield. So that explains why, in Africa, where our species originated, directly beneath some of the most intense UV radiation on the planet, evolution selected rapidly and decisively for dark skin. Greater melanin meant better protected DNA. It meant a lower likelihood of accumulating cancer-causing mutations. It meant longer survival, better health, and, most importantly from evolution's cold, calculating perspective, a greater probability of living long enough to reproduce. Natural selection operates essentially as a very slow, very ruthless optimization algorithm. It has no aesthetic opinions. It doesn't wake up with a vision for what humans should look like. It runs one calculation repeatedly, billions of times, across billions of organisms. Does this trait help you survive long enough to produce offspring? If yes, keep it. If no, eliminate it. Beneath the blazing equatorial African sun, Dark skin was an emphatic, unambiguous yes. Every generation, every time. But here's where the story gets genuinely, unexpectedly complicated. UV radiation doesn't only attack skin cells, it also targets something inside the body. Something small, invisible, and critically important. Something whose destruction, in the wrong person at the wrong moment, can end a pregnancy before it's barely begun. The molecule in question is folate, a form of vitamin B9, which circulates through the bloodstream doing essential biological maintenance. I know that probably sounds like something a doctor mentioned in passing once, but its relevance to skin color is enormous, particularly for pregnant women or those trying to conceive. Folate is essential for neural tube development in embryos. The neural tube is the structure that eventually becomes the brain and spinal cord. Without adequate folate during the first few weeks of pregnancy, sometimes before a woman even knows she's pregnant, the neural tube can fail to close properly. And the consequences are catastrophic. Severe developmental abnormalities, neural tube defects, miscarriage. Here's the problem. UV radiation destroys folate. When UV light penetrates the skin and reaches the bloodstream, it breaks down folate molecules. In a sun-drenched environment like equatorial Africa, with no clothing, no shelter, no sunscreen, UV exposure was constant, intense, and inescapable. This created an additional devastating layer of selection pressure. Pregnant women with lighter skin had less melanin, which allowed more UV to penetrate deeper, which meant higher rates of folate destruction. Higher folate destruction meant higher rates of neural tube defects. Higher rates of neural tube defects meant fewer surviving offspring. So instead of one reason why dark skin was favored under the African sun, there were two completely independent ones. Melanin protected DNA from UV damage, reducing cancer risk. And melanin preserved folate in pregnant women, protecting reproductive success. Two separate threats. One biological solution. Dark skin in Africa wasn't merely advantageous. It was essentially mandatory for the species to persist. So dark skin was a multi-purpose biological instrument, blocking cancer, protecting folate, field-tested and refined across hundreds of thousands of years. If evolution had a rating system, dark skin under equatorial conditions would have a perfect score with an extensive catalog of supporting evidence. So why, given all of that, did it change? Why did populations that left Africa grow progressively lighter over thousands of years? The answer is one of the most elegant and brutal trade-offs in all of evolutionary biology. Between roughly 70,000 and 100,000 years ago, groups of Homo sapiens began leaving Africa. There was no single dramatic moment, no coordinated departure, no announced migration. It was slow generational drift. One group traveled slightly farther than their parents had. Their children went a little farther still. Over millennia, humans spread through the Middle East, into Europe, across Asia, and eventually into the Americas. And as they moved north, something fundamental about their environment shifted. The sun became weaker. Not the sun itself, which remained exactly as indifferent and nuclear as always. But at higher latitudes, sunlight strikes Earth at a shallower angle, passing through substantially more atmosphere before it arrives. UV radiation gets filtered out. Days shorten. Winters grow long and dark. Skies stay overcast for months on end. In Northern Europe, Northern Asia, Canada, the UV environment is radically different from equatorial Africa. Instead of relentlessly intense radiation that needed to be blocked, these populations now faced weak, intermittent radiation they desperately needed to absorb. Suddenly, the same dark skin that had been perfectly suited to Africa became a liability. Not because of cancer. At northern latitudes with weakened UV, cancer risk was considerably lower. Not because of folate. Reduced UV meant reduced folate destruction. No, the problem was something else entirely. Something that rarely gets enough credit in this story. Vitamin D. Vitamin D is synthesized in the skin when UVB radiation strikes a compound called 7-dehydrocholesterol. Your skin functions, quite literally, as a solar panel, using sunlight as an energy source to manufacture this essential molecule. And vitamin D is not optional, not remotely. It's fundamental to human health at nearly every level. Vitamin D regulates the absorption of calcium and phosphorus in the gut. Without it, calcium fails to be properly absorbed regardless of how much you eat. Without calcium, bones don't mineralize correctly. In children, severe vitamin D deficiency produces rickets, a disease that softens and deforms bones, bows the legs outward, flattens the skull, stunts growth. In adult women, the deficiency can cause osteomalacia, which softens the pelvic bones, making childbirth extraordinarily dangerous and sometimes impossible. Women with severe vitamin D deficiency die during labor at dramatically elevated rates. And the consequences don't stop at the skeleton. Vitamin D deficiency impairs immune function, increases susceptibility to infection, diminishes muscle strength, influences cardiovascular health, and some research links chronic deficiency to depression and cognitive decline. When vitamin D runs out, the body starts failing across multiple systems at once. Now place a dark-skinned person in Northern Europe 40,000 years ago. Their melanin is highly efficient, blocking UV radiation effectively. A brilliant adaptation in Africa. But in the gray, overcast, low-light north, that same melanin is now blocking the very UV they need to synthesize vitamin D. Their skin can't distinguish between dangerous radiation to be blocked and beneficial radiation to be absorbed. It just blocks. Vitamin D synthesis falls short. Calcium absorption drops. Bones weaken. Children develop rickets. Women die in childbirth. In a pre-industrial world with no supplements, no fortified food, no medical interventions of any kind, dark skin at northern latitudes wasn't merely a disadvantage. It was a slow death sentence stretched across generations. And evolution, that cold, merciless, endlessly patient calculator, began selecting against it. Mutations that reduced melanin production appeared in the population randomly, as mutations always do. But instead of being eliminated, they spread. Because individuals with marginally lighter skin synthesized marginally more vitamin D, had marginally healthier bones, and achieved marginally higher reproductive success. Generation after generation, slightly lighter, slightly lighter, slightly lighter. Over thousands of years, the average skin tone of northern populations drifted toward lower pigmentation. Not because anyone chose it, not because of cultural preference or social pressure, but because in that specific environment, at that specific latitude, with that specific quantity of available sunlight, lighter skin kept more people alive. The algorithm had simply reversed its inputs. Now, and this is the part I kept thinking about after I first read it. For a long time, scientists assumed the depigmentation of European populations happened gradually across hundreds of thousands of years. A slow, steady evolutionary drift accompanying the northward migration. Recent ancient DNA analysis has completely dismantled that assumption and replaced it with something far more interesting. Early European hunter-gatherers, the people who inhabited Europe for tens of thousands of years after the initial migration out of Africa, remained significantly dark-skinned. Even after living at northern latitudes for an extended period, they hadn't dramatically depigmented. The most well-known example is a specimen called Cheddar Man. He lived in what is now Britain approximately 10,000 years ago. Ancient DNA analysis published in 2018 indicated he likely had dark to medium dark skin, dark curly hair, and blue eyes. A combination that seems almost paradoxical to modern observers, given how strongly we associate blue eyes with very pale skin. 10,000 years ago, though, that pairing hadn't yet become the norm. The extremely fair skin now associated with northwestern Europeans, the kind that burns after roughly 12 minutes of summer sun, appears to have spread widely across European populations only within the last 6,000 to 8,000 years. And honestly, that's a shockingly compressed time frame. In the full 300,000-year history of Homo sapiens, it represents less than the final 3%. So what happened 6,000 to 8,000 years ago that accelerated this so dramatically? The answer involves one of the most consequential transitions in human history, and almost nobody talks about its effect on skin color. The Neolithic Revolution, the shift from hunting and gathering to agriculture, fundamentally and permanently transformed the human diet. Hunter-gatherers ate a varied diet that naturally delivered substantial amounts of vitamin D. Fatty fish like salmon and mackerel, organ meats like liver and kidney, shellfish, other animal products that rank among the richest dietary sources of vitamin D available. Farming populations, by contrast, subsisted primarily on cereals, wheat, barley, oats, rye, carbohydrates that contribute almost nothing in terms of vitamin D. Dietary vitamin D didn't just decrease, it collapsed. Populations that had previously managed with modest UV-synthesized vitamin D, supplemented by dietary sources, were now almost entirely dependent on whatever their skin could manufacture from available sunlight. And if their skin still carried substantial melanin, that wasn't going to be enough. The selective pressure favoring lighter skin intensified sharply. Even marginal increases in vitamin D synthesis capacity, even fractionally reduced melanin production, became critical to survival. Oh, and there was a second factor, and this one really accelerated things. Farming communities were large, dense, and sedentary. Population size and density have enormous effects on how rapidly an advantageous mutation can spread through a gene pool. In a small, dispersed hunter-gatherer band of 50 people, a beneficial mutation might take a very long time to reach even neighboring groups. In a farming village of hundreds, connected to a network of other farming villages, that same mutation can reach thousands of descendants within just a few generations. The combination, dietary vitamin D collapse plus population density, essentially hit the fast-forward button on European depigmentation. Within a few thousand years, a selective pressure that had been quietly nudging skin tones lighter across tens of millennia suddenly became intense, rapid, and clearly visible in the archaeological record. Here's something that genuinely surprises most people when they first encounter it. Skin color isn't governed by a single gene. There's no dark skin gene and light skin gene where one just dominates the other. The reality is considerably more complex than that. Skin pigmentation is what's called a polygenic trait, shaped by dozens of genes working in concert. Genes that influence how much melanin is produced, what type of melanin is synthesized, how melanin granules are distributed within skin cells, and how the skin responds to UV exposure over time. And what makes this particularly remarkable, stay with me, because this is where it gets really interesting, is that different populations that independently evolved lighter skin didn't use the same genes to do it. East Asians and Europeans both carry significantly lighter skin than equatorial Africans, but the genetic variants underlying lighter pigmentation in East Asians are largely distinct from those responsible in Europeans. Both populations arrived at a similar outcome through entirely different molecular routes. This is called convergent evolution. The same adaptive solution, independently discovered through completely different genetic pathways by separate populations on separate continents. The evolutionary pressure was so strong, so consistent, and so unambiguous that natural selection found the same answer multiple times. Not once. Multiple times, independently. When evolution keeps reinventing something from scratch, that's about as clear a biological signal as exists that the trait truly matters for survival. And while we're on the subject of genetics, consider something equally extraordinary. Blue eyes. Every person alive today with blue eyes, every single one without exception, descends from one specific individual. One person, one mutation, one moment. Somewhere in the region of the Black Sea approximately 6,000 to 10,000 years ago. Before that individual was born, the entire human species had brown eyes. Brown universally as far back as the record goes. Then one mutation appeared. A change that reduced melanin production specifically in the iris. It spread slowly at first, then more rapidly, likely because it was genetically linked to skin pigmentation variants that were themselves under strong selection pressure. Now think about that. Something as seemingly ancient and fundamental as blue eyes, something used throughout history to sort and categorize human beings, is younger than the invention of agriculture, younger than Stonehenge, younger than the domestication of the horse. Traits we treat as ancient and immutable are, in geological or even historical terms, essentially brand new. The version of humanity we consider fixed and permanent is still being written. So when you step back and look at the complete picture, here's what you see. Skin color. The characteristic that has defined so much of human history, shaped political systems, justified atrocities, and divided people into hierarchies for millennia. At its biological core, it is a UV calibration system. It is a dial, an adjustment mechanism. Your body's best ancestral estimate of how much UV protection was required given the latitude your distant ancestors happened to occupy, the diet they happened to eat, and the sun they happened to live beneath. Light skin is not superior in any absolute sense. In equatorial environments, it's actively dangerous. More UV penetration, greater DNA damage, elevated cancer risk, accelerated folate destruction. Light skin in Africa is a genuine survival disadvantage. Dark skin is not primitive or less evolved. It is the ancestral state, the original configuration, the baseline from which everything else is a modification. If anything, lighter skin is the newer version, the adaptation, the variation. Dark skin is the default. And the deepest irony of all? The same sun that drove some populations to develop more melanin to survive its intensity also drove other populations to develop less melanin because they needed more of its limited energy. The sun chose no sides. It had no preferences. It radiated indifferently and let evolution sort out the rest. An entire civilization's architecture of prejudice,